Hello and welcome back to the Historical Raven channel. I'm Raven, they, them, and this is Pop Culture, Nerdom, and History, where we dive into historical inspirations of your favorite series. Before we begin, I want to apologize for last episode. I'm learning how to edit videos on the fly, and last video, I thought something was going to happen that didn't. What I wanted to happen was for the video of the race to be compressed so that it was a little bit faster, but you saw the whole thing. Instead, what happened is it cut off a significant portion of the end of the race, and you didn't get to see that. For that, I apologize. That is my fault. Now onto it. Also, I'd like to put a content warning here. Usual content warning: supply, war, torture, death, Nazis, Nazi collaborators, gunfights. Yeah. And as always, the timeline for Star Wars is a guess. I tried to stick to the timeline I put for of collaborator police. I don't guarantee the accuracy of either. This one I think is going to be a little bit more accurate to the timeline within the show. But with that, might end up being different than the timeline that I put into of collaborator police. And if that's the case, this is the correct timeline. Um, Also, I made an episode in that I made a mistake in that episode because I can talk, which will be rectified here. If you've watched it, yeah, you'll see it. Also, going to apologize for butchering Czech words and names. Try my best with the pronunciation. I've never spoken Czech in my life. I'm just going with what I can. Now, on with it. 5. Before Battle of Yavin. Ferrix, Marlani System. Bix, Kathleen, and Cassian Andor speak in hushed voices. Andor had come to Bix to request she call her contact for a sale. She tells him it's not possible as she only calls her contact once a month, and she just did a few weeks prior. After a few minutes of going back and forth, including Andor accusing Bix of stealing from her shop, Bix finally agrees to call the buyer and Andor leaves. Talking to Tim quickly, Bix's current boyfriend and business partner. A few hours later, Bix informs Tim that she's running some errands. She rushes off, and Tim, suspicious that she's cheating on him with Andor, chases after her a moment later. She loses him in the streets and goes to another shop. There, she talks to the owner, Salman Pak, for a moment before he sends her to a hidden communicator. She goes, calls her contact, informing him of a meeting and a sale. That night, Tim sees a memo from Primor Security that Bix had up on her screen. The memo describes Andor without naming him, calling him a suspect in a double murder from the day before. Bix sees Andor again, with Tim secretly watching the two from afar. Bix confronts Andor about the killings and then informs him the buyer is on his way. When Andor leaves, a drunken Tim follows him before calling Primor Security about the whereabouts and the name of Andor Cassian. Cassian Andor. The next day, the contact, Luthen Rail, arrives on Ferrix. As he walks through the dirt roads of the town, Bix walks up, and the two start discussing the situation, including the fact that Primor Security is looking for Andor. The pair discuss whether the security forces know Andor's name or what he looks like, and Luthen says they need to be quick. The two part ways, with Bix going to work and Luthen going to the meeting point. Andor arrives at the meeting point, and Luthen is already there waiting. Luthen watches the younger man for a moment before showing his face and discussing what Andor wants to sell. The two spend a few tense moments talking about price and whether the piece Andor is selling is worth the price. Two go back and forth, with Luthen slowly changing the topic to Andor on joining the rebellion. He gets Andor to tell him how he stole the piece. The discussion continues, with Luthen bringing up Andor's foster father, at which point the younger man pulls a blaster. Luthen stays calm and talks Andor down from shooting the old man, recruiting Andor in the process. Simultaneously, alarms ring through the streets of Ferrix as people bang on metal pipes. People scramble away from the Primor security forces, including Bix. She gets through a few streets before security forces see her and pulls their blaster on her. They take her into custody as a blaster fight breaks out between Andor and another security team. She makes one attempt to escape, for which she's slammed against a wall and handcuffed to a pipe. Tim sees her on her knees and demands to know what happens. When he rushes towards her, a security member shoots him in the chest before he is left to die with Bix still handcuffed to the pipe. Andor and Luthen fight their way out of the meeting building, and then fight their way through the streets. Momentarily taking a Primor security member hostage, they learn the number of men there before knocking the man out and making their escape. They use an abandoned vehicle as a decoy, blowing it up as they leave on a speeder bike. The two leave the system, and the mess left after the raid. After the raid, the people of Ferrix sit with consequences. Two friends free Bix from her handcuffs before dragging her away from Tim's body as she reaches for him. Marva Andor, Cassian's adopted mother, sits in a ransacked house. Other members of the town clean up the area and repair what they can. Days later, Andor returns to Ferrix. He finds Marva in their home, who informs him the Empire pushed Primor security out and has taken over. She also tells him who gave him up and how Bix tried to stop Tim. Cassian tells his mother that they can leave because they have all the money that they want to go anywhere in the galaxy, but Marva says she's going to stay. Cassian sees how sick Marva looks and agrees to put it on hold. Next morning, however, Marva informs Cassian she's not leaving and she's going to stand and fight against the Empire instead. She informs him that she heard about the raid on Aldhani while he was gone and that she was proud of it. Weeks later, Bix tries contacting Luthen again. Luthen's assistant, Clea Markey, doesn't answer and tells Luthen that it's too dangerous. This contact comes up on Imperial scanners, and stormtroopers are sent to capture her. Despite running and interference from friends, the Imperials capture Bix, who also learns that Pac was captured and tortured for information. Bix is interrogated by the ISB and suffers the same audio torture for weeks. When not being tortured, Bix sits in a lonely cell with a window high in the wall being her only source of light. More than a month after she lost all Andor, Marva dies of old age. The people of Ferrix request permission to hold her funeral and a procession through town. It's granted and planning begins. Pac's son, Wilman, has spent the last few weeks building a bomb after his father's death. Cassian, having coming back after word of his mother's death, sits in an abandoned ship and listens to a dead rebels manifest. Like the rest of Ferrix, he is getting ready to rebel and free the town, even if he doesn't know it. At the clang of the anvil, the town center calls. At the clang of the anvil, the town center call, Marva's funeral begins. Two parts of a marching band situated around the town center begin playing their funeral march. People fall in behind the procession. Wilmon leaves his house and heads towards the center of town. Citizens stand on the side of the parade route silently before joining themselves. Other citizens stay to the side and watch. Stormtroopers with riot gear are sent out to contain the area, and eventually hundreds of Ferrix citizens stand silently for Marva's funeral. The marching band stops playing as they reach the square, facing down the garrison of stormtroopers. Without a word, the marching band begins moving quickly towards the stormtroopers down the block, the citizens of Ferrix right behind them. The tension is at a breaking point when the band stops a few meters away from the troopers. When they do, a prominent citizen, Brasso, begins the funeral rites. When he finishes, Marva's droid plays a recording Marva made before her death. In it, Marva speaks to the people of Ferrix and discusses her life. She lifts those still alive and talks them into revolting against the Empire. An Imperial officer, having had enough of Marva's talking against the Empire, tries to put stop to the recording. When that fails, Marva's hologram tells the people to fight the Empire, to which the officer yells, "Enough!" and flips the droid. At this, the Ferrix riot begins. The officer and two troops trying to stop the recording are knocked out by Brasso and a few others. Another officer commands his troops to get ready, and the crowd surges forward. Chaos ensues, and the officer orders the stormtrooper to make the man on the tower stop clanging the anvil. As the citizens surge forward, some of them are dragged down, hit across the head, and taken into custody. Out of nowhere, a bomb explodes, killing stormtroopers and setting off secondary explosions. The pipe bomb Wilmon Pack built had worked perfectly and had stopped the chaos momentarily, as everyone in the area had been forced to the ground. A thick cloud of smoke covers the town square as people get up. An Imperial soldier finds a civilian and smashes his face with a baton. Troopers surge forward and begin beating civilians as stormtroopers march forward with their blasters at the ready. The officer from the start of the riot orders his men to fire. They do, killing people almost immediately. Two stormtroopers find Wilmot and punch him before taking him into custody. Unarmed citizens fight as best they can, but are pushed out of the square. The riot ends with dozens dead on both sides. October 28th, 1939, Prague, occupied Czechoslovakia. After weeks of the city being flooded by leaflets encouraging small forms of resistance against Nazi occupation, small groups of students began gathering in Wenceslas Square. The students wore black and blue ribbons on their lapels or riding hats, initially just standing in protest and talking amongst themselves. The students began singing songs and demanding their freedom and support for their exiled president, Edvard Beneš. Eventually, a group of protesters moved about a kilometer northwest to Old Town Square. At the Old Town Square, German civilians heckled the Czech students, and fights between the two groups break out sporadically. The singing and chanting continue as more people join the competing groups. A few hours later, and at the request of Germans who had gathered in front of the Gestapo building to the northeast of Wenceslas Square, German and collaborator police began pushing out the students away from Wenceslas and into the streets. With a few short scraps, the protesters are eventually pushed out of the square for a while. 2 blocks away, a separate group of protesters stormed the Palace Hotel. The hotel had been used by the Gestapo and held a few detainees. In the invasion, a detainee escapes and the group leaves, returning to Wenceslas Square, which protesters had managed to enter once again. The police continued to push the protesters out, with shots being fired occasionally to disperse the crowd when German police forces show up. The protests finally leave Wenceslas Square, but head towards Masaryk Station, Vinohrady, and other areas of the city late in the evening. In the violence of the day, 400 Czech protesters are detained and 15 are hospitalized, 2 of which were shot. One of the men, Václav Sedlček, is killed immediately. The second, Jean Opletal, will spend 2 weeks in the hospital after taking a bullet to the stomach. Opletal was a medical student at Charles University and served as deputy chairman for the student government of the university. Word of his shooting and death spread quickly, and his funeral was planned for November 15th. November 15th, Prague, occupied Czechoslovakia. With black flags flying at university dormitories across the city, more than 3,000 students attend Jean's funeral. This group was meant to be comprised of only German students. However, the makeup is not fully known. When his coffin is put into the back of a hearse, 300 students follow it from his former dormitory to the city's main railway station, where he would take his final trip back to his hometown, Naklo. As the hearse leaves, the remaining students begin singing the national anthem. A group of 500 students headed towards Karlovo na Misty, a kilometer southwest of Wenceslas Square. This led to a fight with the collaborator police and students proclaiming, "Long live Czechoslovakia" and "Long live freedom." The police did what they could to disperse the growing crowd. However, when K.H. Frank, the Nazi Minister of Education of occupied Czechoslovakia, arrived, the students crowded the car and assaulted his chauffeur. They left the driver with a broken nose and a black eye. The protesters moved on and wound up at the Old Town Hall Chapel, and sang the national anthem in front of the Faculty of Law. These protests would end at noon. The story doesn't end here, but it feels like a good place to stop. What happens later, the retribution committed by the Nazis, feels better suited for another story, especially since it was ordered directly by Hitler. And while I don't normally do this, I'm going to add some opinion here. I wasn't expecting to find something that made me go, "That's it," the way I did when I found the story of the Prague protest and funeral riot. This was originally going to be about the French resistance, specifically the liberation of Paris. Then it was about the Polish resistance in Warsaw. However, when I saw that a small protest erupted after the funeral of a student body leader was killed, I knew that was the story. I also know that this doesn't fit one-to-one with the fiction. In Andor, the funeral was first and the riot was the result. However, the fact that Jean Opletal's death was the catalyst for the protest on 15 November shouldn't be ignored. His death was Marva's fight the Empire in Andor. It was the spark. I'm also going to admit that I'm not the right person to tell this story. When looking for this, I really couldn't find a lot. I'm using 2, maybe 3 sources here. And that's not enough, especially not for the riot and for the funeral and for what happened afterwards. His story needs to be told better. And even the story of the riot the day he got shot needs to be told better. And I hope that my short description, my all too short, all too abbreviated description of this, sends you out looking for it. Because what they did, what those students did, what the Czech students and the German students to some point did on those days in 1939, that's something to look to for inspiration. And I think, as for inspiration with Andor, I think that's a good inspirational story to use. Thank you for joining me today for this exploration into history and fiction. I hope I was able to ignite a curiosity in you. If you enjoyed this video or the race on screen, give me your like. If you want more, consider subscribing. As always, my sources are in the description. Have a good day, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.